Are we decent people or just enforcers when no one is looking? What if a kicked plastic bin could expose the illusion we live by? Tonight, I'm asking you to watch the truth we hide under a lid. You and I begin in the quiet choreography of a cul-de-sac where the asphalt is a black stage and a blue recycling bin is our reluctant prop. I tell you this because every small place is a laboratory for power, and tonight our lab smells like grass clippings, detergent, and the iron tang of anger that someone mistakes for authority. I live inside an HOA, a neat grid of bylaws and hedge lines, and you might think those rules keep order, but I ask you, do rules tame us or teach us how to hide? The camera above my porch glows like a watchful pupil, a small, unblinking circle that says nothing and remembers everything. Before anything happens, I want you to meet Michel Foucault, not the man himself, but the ghost of his idea that surveillance builds the cage we carry inside our ribs. He wrote about the panopticon, a prison whose genius is not bars, but maybe the suspicion that someone might be watching, and I have learned that HOAs are small, decorative panopticons with petunias. Do you feel the nervous itch already, the way a neighborhood can turn into an exam room where your trash habits become proof of your soul? I can almost hear you asking whether I am being dramatic, and I am, but drama is just the sound power makes when it rubs against dignity. My neighbor, who will soon kick my bin, is already narrating me in his head, and he thinks the story ends with me learning a lesson he likes. I am narrating him too, and maybe that is my arrogance, but I promise to show you why the camera matters and why it does not. Because if Foucault taught me that the watchful eye reshapes the watched, Hannah Arendt slips in to remind me how ordinary people do ordinary cruelties in the name of ordinary rules. We call it the banality of evil, but in the suburbs it wears a safety vest and carries a clipboard and introduces itself as compliance. I place the bin at the curb within the permitted window, and I do it not to obey, but to test whether obedience ever buys safety. There is a thinness to the air when you suspect conflict is coming, as if oxygen itself is rehearsing its exit. I do not want to fight, and yet I am already composing the fight in my mind, which means the fight is halfway here. You want evidence, and I will give you evidence, but first I need you to question the appetite for it, because evidence is not the same as truth. Evidence persuades the committee, truth interrogates the soul. The lens above my door is a coin, heads facing justice, tails facing spectacle, and I cannot control which way it lands. I whisper to you that we are all both audience and actor in this neighborhood theater, and the HOA is the lighting designer who insists on fluorescent honesty. He, the neighbor, has sent emails with attachments and timestamps and phrases like, for the record, and I have learned that records are often knives disguised as spreadsheets. I have set the camera not to trap him, but to trap the story he tries to sell me about myself. There is a difference, and it will matter. Listen to the sprinklers ticking like a metronome for anxiety while porch flags barely stir, as if patriotism itself is tired of being invoked over plastic bins. I breathe in and decide that tonight I will not apologize for existing in the space between lines on a map I pay to maintain. You may think this is only about trash, but trash is a ritual, and rituals are where a community reveals what it worships. We worship tidiness because it lets us pretend our messes are exceptions we can hide behind garage doors. We worship compliance because it tastes like power without the guilt of cruelty. We worship surveillance because it lets us feel innocent while we aim our suspicion at the neighbor whose garden we secretly envy. I am not innocent either, which is why I turn the camera on and then turn it inward, asking whether I want proof or revenge. If I am honest, the difference is as thin as the plastic wall of the bin he will kick. On screen, the word illusion will float for a beat, and I will ask you whether the illusion is the rule book or our faith in what the rule book can absolve. On screen, the word truth will replace it, slower this time, heavier, like a gavel that wants to be a mirror. I am ready and not ready, which is how every confrontation begins, with a body braced and a voice practicing its calm. The sun is low, the cameras catch that cinematic gold every app loves, and I hate that I notice the aesthetics of conflict while bracing for its harm. You and I are complicit together now because you want to see what happens and I want you to see it, and that hunger is the engine of this story. Somewhere in the quiet, a garage door sighs open, which is how violence sometimes arrives in the suburbs with a polite mechanical preface. I feel the old fear, the childlike fear, that if I am watched and judged, I might vanish into someone else's verdict. I tell myself that dignity is a muscle you train by refusing cheap humiliations even when your hands shake. I tell you that the camera is not my courage, it is only my witness. I tell you that when he finally kicks the bin and notices the lens blinking like a tiny star, the universe will not change, but perhaps the story will. I promised you a build-up. And the build-up begins with the most dangerous ornament in a quiet neighborhood, a smiling consensus that feels like kindness yet functions like control, a quilt of rules stitched so tightly that breath itself sounds like a violation. We call it community standards, but in practice those standards behave like a velvet choke chain, soft to the skin, while narrowing the airway of what a person is allowed to be. On screen, the word order glides in and hangs like a held breath, a graphic lullaby for anxious adults who have mistaken predictability for virtue. I hold up the handbook, 12 stapled pages, serif font, margins like white fences, and it reads like a catechism of permissible colors, approved foliage, and the sacred distances between plastic bins and curbs. It masquerades as a love letter to symmetry. Yet every love letter has a jealous twin that hates whatever is different, and that twin speaks in fines, warnings, and the ever-present threat of further action. You ask why trash matters. And I answer that the way we treat trash is how we treat each other when we want to pretend the mess is not ours, when we need a stage on which to practice superiority without using the word. Before the neighbor even steps into frame, he appears in fragments. A forwarded email at 6:12 a.m., a screenshot annotated with arrows, a sentence that begins with "per my understanding" and ends with a smiley face that feels like a slap. I film the street at dusk and whisper that dusk is the hour when illusions travel best because edges dissolve into suggestion, and suggestion is where power plants its flags. On screen, illusion pulses twice and fades, the way certainty fades when you pause a video and notice 100 small truths hiding in the blur of a single motion. My palm curls around the molded handle of the bin, and I feel how an object designed for utility can be repurposed as a stage prop for hierarchy, a portable altar on which petty gods demand offerings of obedience. The camera, my small mechanical witness, lays invisible grid lines across the asphalt, and those grid lines resemble a chessboard where pawns do not realize that promotion is possible because the handbook never mentions it. Another email arrives, and the word violation blooms like a rubber stamp across my name, yet the timestamp on my footage contradicts the timestamp in his outrage. And already we are arguing about time as though time itself must seek approval from the board. I speak to you directly because conspiracies thrive in silence, and this is not a conspiracy. This is a syllabus for how power performs its magic trick, palms open, sleeves rolled, audience hypnotized by procedure. The trick is crude yet effective. Call control safety, call humiliation standards, call fear civility, and then insist that any discomfort you feel is merely the growing pain of becoming a good neighbor. When the board replies with formulaic concern, "We appreciate your commitment to our shared values," I hear the bureaucratic melody that always plays before someone gets smaller, a hold music for the soul. We slide too fast over reasonable person. So I freeze frame the clause that grants infinite discretion wrapped in gentle grammar, a legal fog that condenses on whichever forehead the committee dislikes. Tell me, is a reasonable person the one who owns more property, speaks with more confidence, or copies the attorney on the thread to make everyone else blink first? I place the bin precisely 6 inches from the curb because the rule says 6 to 12, and I choose the minimum like a dare to the measuring tape holstered in his pocket like a badge. On screen, measured obedience appears, and I ask whether obedience still counts as obedience when you design it to expose the ritual's emptiness, when you comply not to belong but to reveal the cost of belonging. The sprinklers hiss like lowercase anger, the doorbell lens glows like a sleepless pupil, and the neighbor's approaching footsteps punctuate the evening as if trying to end a sentence I am still midway through writing. He clears his throat the way men clear their throats when they want the world to make room for their interpretation. A small sound rehearsed 1,000 times in rooms where apology is for other people. Do you feel the heat rise even though the air cools? Do you feel the script tightening around both of us like a belt we pretend is fashion? The most violent tool in suburbia is not a boot. It is a narrative that assigns guilt before the act, a story so sticky that even the innocent walk like suspects. I show you a still of his shadow crossing my driveway like a sundial that measures entitlement instead of time, and the hour it declares is always now, now, now. The board packet includes a photo of a different house's bin placed at a photogenic right angle, righteousness rendered as clip art, an altar to the god of aligning edges. Comparison is the HOA's true currency because nothing disciplines the human animal like the rumor that someone else is more correct than you, a rumor that turns the neighborhood into a quiet arms race of immaculate appearances. On screen, truth arrives slightly off-center and stays there because truth rarely stands in the exact middle of a meeting room. It leans, it limps, it makes eye contact from the margins. I wonder aloud if his anger is about the bin or about a life that no longer kicks back the way the brochure promised. And I ask whether this plastic object is simply the safest surface on which to spend a surplus of resentment. It matters because misdirected pain is the most common code violation we never cite, a leak under the slab that warps the floorboards of every conversation. I do not excuse him. And I do not excuse myself for enjoying the balcony of moral height, the privileged view from which outrage feels like oxygen and certainty tastes like dessert. We slow the footage to witness how posture becomes prophecy. The forward lean, the left shoulder dip, the micropause where intent hardens into act, the anatomy of a kick that is also an argument. On screen, power slides under his shoes like a caption. And I explain that power always seeks a physical echo to prove it existed, a thud, a scrape, a bruise, a crack, something the body remembers when language starts lying. I speak to you and to the lens and to the committee I imagine, because in HOA land the future is just a roomful of neighbors pretending to be judges and asking the minutes to absolve them. What are we afraid of? If not the possibility that identity is merely a list of permissions we obeyed in exchange for being left alone, a quiet bargain we call adulthood. I tilt the narrative and ask you to practice a dangerous skill, compassion without surrender, because complicity often wears the face of mercy while collecting evidence behind its back. He circles the bin as if orbiting a grievance he cannot name without losing its voltage, and the orbit itself becomes accusation, a planet sized like a cul-de-sac, but heavy as a verdict. I keep filming because to look away would be to become my own unreliable witness, and survival has taught me that memory needs corroboration when authority arrives smiling. We are inches from the moment, and the discomfort I promised you compresses the ears like cabin pressure before turbulence, a hush that makes the next sound inevitable. If you came for a neat villain, you will be disappointed, and if you came for a neat hero, you will be implicated because neatness is the first casualty of honesty. This is the build-up, the slow tightening, the dismantling of normal until the bones of power lie bare. And now all that remains is the inevitable choreography of a foot meeting plastic and a face tilting upward toward the tiny red that means he has been seen. The foot connects with the bin, a dull plastic thunder that startles the crickets into silence. And in that thud, my quiet street finally admits what it has rehearsed for years. The lid flips, the bin wobbles, and a constellation of bottle glint spins in the porch light like loose thoughts fleeing a skull. I feel the shock ripple through my sternum, not as fear but as recognition, because violence always sounds familiar when power has been whispering it first. On screen, the word impact blooms, then fractures into fact, a visual pun that makes my producer brain smile while my human heart stays clenched. He inhales sharply, notices the red recording dot, and his pupils tighten like doors slamming on a hallway of excuses. For a second, he tries to rewind time with posture, untensing his shoulders as if etiquette could glue the lid back on and reseat the bottles. Really, I say through the intercom, and my voice surprises me by sounding like a narrator and a plaintiff and a neighbor all at once. He turns toward the lens with the reflex of a man who has not yet learned that explanations look smaller when they're filmed. On screen, the caption truth, not angle, drifts up and settles in the lower third, a reminder to the audience, and to me that framing is power and responsibility. He begins the ritual apology, that bureaucratic mea culpa that travels with men like him, conditional, procedural, defensively polite. The rules, he says, and the words arrive like a talisman he expects will stun my camera into forgiveness. I answer that the rules do not authorize his foot, and a tight silence opens like an elevator door between floors of self-respect. He looks around for witnesses and finds only the lens, the porch light, and a neighborhood that pretends not to stare. I keep my tone level because calm is a scalpel, and hysteria is the curtain he wants to drop over the stage. Step back from my property, I say, and the sentence steadies the asphalt as if reminding gravity of its job. On-screen boundary pulses, then fades into bond, and I ask the audience under my breath whether communities prefer fences to friendships because fences are easier to audit. He mutters that he is only keeping standards, and I ask which standard is satisfied by a kick, order, masculinity, boredom, or the wish to externalize a private bruise. The door behind me remains closed, and I remember Foucault again, how the suspicion of being seen disciplines the body even before the punishment arrives. Here, the punishment is simply the truth that the camera does not forget, and forgetting is the first luxury of the powerful. I narrate to you that we have reached the hinge of the story, the exact second where illusion gives up its costume and walks onto the stage naked. He shuffles, decants his anger into syntax, and arrives at the classic defense. It's not what it looks like. I remind him that it is precisely what it looks like because the look is the act, and the act has been recorded at 4K with the kind of indifference only machines can afford. On-screen, record stacks over a chord, a pair of rhymes to underline the gap between what is captured and what we might agree upon. He lunges toward the bin to write it, and the gesture is part repair, part erasure, part unconvincing magic trick performed after the audience has already seen the trapdoor. I tell him the footage will be shared with the board, and, if necessary, with the police, not as a threat, but as a refusal to carry his secret for him. His jaw works like a broken hinge, and I see the boy he once was realizing that the hall monitor badge does not protect against the principle of reality. He retreats 2 steps and then advances 1, a choreography of uncertainty that broadcasts the most human truth of all: power hates witnesses. I give him a choice on the record: acknowledge the act, apologize, replace the damaged bin, and agree to stop contacting me directly about violations. He asks if we can handle it neighbor to neighbor, and I tell him that neighborliness began the moment before the kick, not after it. On screen, the phrase banality with boots appears for 2 beats, because sometimes the philosophy lecture needs a caption that smells like rubber. The intercom speaker crackles, lending my words a courtroom timbre, and I proceed to state the facts in simple sentences because simplicity is how you keep dignity from bleeding out. He asks if I'm really going to escalate this, and I hear the oldest trick in the book, confusing accountability with escalation. I counter that escalation happened at the moment kinetic energy met municipal plastic, and the rest of us are just filing the paperwork. The camera timecode ticks in the upper corner like a metronome for conscience, and I let the silence stretch so the street can listen to itself. He finally says, "I'm sorry," but the sentence arrives dragging a train of qualifiers, so I ask for the cargo to be uncoupled and the engine to stand alone. He tries again, clean, unmodified, and there it is, a small, unspectacular truth sturdy enough to carry weight. I tell him the repair will be documented, the replacement receipt emailed, and any future concerns routed through the official channel that keeps his feet far from my bins. On-screen, process dissolves into promise, and I underline for you that procedures are only moral when they protect the less powerful, not when they launder aggression. He backs away, turns once toward the blinking eye, and the look on his face is the precise shape of modern accountability: resentful, bewildered, undeniably real. The lid settles, the bottle's quiet, the night breathes again, and I tell you straight into the lens that this is what truth feels like in the suburbs, not dramatic justice, just the end of a lie with nowhere left to hide. After the thud fades, the night resumes its indifferent breathing, and I feel the neighborhood look away the way people do in elevators when conscience gets cramped. The bin is upright again, but order is not, and I know that what we call resolution is often just a ceasefire between 2 different stories of the same street. I email the board with the clip attached, concise subject line, time code in the body, and a calm that tastes like metal on my tongue. On screen, the word accountability surfaces and hovers because without that word footage is only gossip with better pixels. He sends a follow-up apology before dawn, the kind that leans on exhaustion like a character witness, and I accept it while refusing to let it erase the record. By mid-morning, the board replies with phrases harvested from policy orchards. We take this seriously, we appreciate the evidence, we will review, and the translation reads simply, now the camera watches them too. I think about how power flows like water toward the lowest breach, and how last night's kick widened a crack that has been spidering through this cul-de-sac for years. Neighbors text me privately, some whispering solidarity, some requesting the clip, some confessing they felt the same pressure but turned it inward until it bruised the soft parts of their lives. On screen, rebalancing drifts in and fades, a quiet graphic to mark the moment the center of gravity shifts from rumor to record. I step outside with a broom and dignity because cleanup is a ritual and rituals are the scaffolding we use to keep from falling into the whole events leave behind. The bottles clink like punctuation to a long, difficult sentence, and I realize I have been writing this paragraph with my life for years. He walks his dog at noon with theatrical casualness, and our eyes meet for a second that lasts a paragraph. Then we both choose the hard mercy of not performing for the sidewalk. I send him a receipt for the replacement bin he offered to buy, and add a single line. Future concerns go through official channels, not through kicks. On screen, boundary returns with a thinner weight, then morphs into bond, because the most honest fences are the ones that protect without pretending to love. At the emergency board meeting, the agenda item is clinical. Incident at lot 18, 2114 hours, but the room smells like citrus cleaner and embarrassment. They play the clip without commentary, and the only sound for 5 seconds is the hum of the projector behaving better than any of us. A director clears her throat and reaches for language that won't incriminate the institution that trained the kick, and I realize how hard it is to punish a symptom without x-raying the culture. I speak once briefly to name what happened and what must not happen again, and to remind them that the point is not my bin but our bargain. On screen, cost of order lands like a stamp, and I ask them to reckon with the invoice that neatness keeps hiding in the potted ficus. Because order extracted under fear is not order, it is choreography for a funeral where the corpse is the neighborly imagination. They vote to issue a formal reprimand, to require conflict training, to update the handbook with a sentence that should have been obvious. Property is not a body bag for anger. The motion passes, the minutes are typed. And yet I know this is only paperwork unless it rewires the reflex that mistook vigilance for virtue. I walk home under a sky that feels unedited, and I tell you that relief is not joy. Relief is a temporary ceasefire signed by fatigue. My porch light blinks, once as if winking at the lens, and I consider pointing the camera back indoors so that I remember to surveil the empire inside me with the same rigor I apply to the street. On screen, introspection glows, and I confess that victory tastes faintly of ash because I have won with a tool that can also wound. The messages keep arriving, some warm, some warning me that making trouble is a kind of untidiness, and I resist the old temptation to apologize for breathing too loudly in a room built by my dues. A neighbor 2 houses down asks for advice about a letter she got last month for parking her daughter's rusted sedan in view of the cul-de-sac, and I hear in her voice the thin wire of shame that rules pluck to make citizens hum. We watch the clip together, pausing not at the kick, but at the micro gestures that precede it, and she says she recognizes that posture from a former boss who never raised his voice but rearranged careers with a smile. On screen, pattern floats, because a single act is a map if you know how to read the folds. I tell her the difference between escalation and accountability again, and we rehearse sentences that keep dignity from bleeding out at the curb. In the days that follow, the street becomes awkwardly polite, which is another way of saying the masks have been refitted with stronger elastic. He keeps his distance, and when our paths cross he holds the leash shorter, as if control will redeem control, as if a tighter grip can unsay a recorded truth. I try a small experiment, and wave once, a quiet test of whether consequence must always calcify into contempt. He nods without smiling, and I accept that civility may be the most we can build right now, without lying to ourselves about forgiveness. On screen, order returns stripped of glamour, and underneath it a smaller word flickers. Care, asking whether order is worth anything if it does not metabolize into care. I tell you plainly that the cost of order here was paid in hours of worry, in a pulse that sprinted in place, in the feeling of being an exhibit in a museum curated by etiquette. Yet I also tell you that boundaries drawn with clarity can be bridges if we walk them with humility, and that the camera, for all its coldness, can be a lantern instead of a weapon when pointed at behavior rather than being. I return to the curb on the next collection day and place the new bin at 6 inches, not to taunt but to practice a discipline that is mine and not theirs. The truck arrives, the arm lifts, the lid yawns, the emptiness is swallowed, and for a heartbeat the whole street appears capable of digesting its waste without digesting its people. I look into the lens one last time that evening and say to you that order which requires silence will always cost more than it claims, and that tonight we paid a different price, the price of speaking, the price that buys a future where a foot remembers itself before it rises. I promised you a conclusion, but conclusions are only crossroads with better lighting, so let me stand with you under this lamp and say the harsh truth plainly. The kick bin was never about trash. It was about a worldview that treats people as clutter until they align. And if we are honest, some days we hold the broom. I tell you this not to scold, but to recruit, because what you watched on my curb is the smallest unit of a larger metabolism that digests dissent and calls the belch civility. On screen, truth arrives again, not as a verdict this time, but as an invitation, and I ask you whether you are brave enough to answer without pretending you don't know your own reflexes. I say we, not he, because the camera that caught his kick can also catch my vanity, my appetite for performative righteousness, my temptation to narrate myself as hero while drinking the sweet liquor of your sympathy. The lesson isn't install more cameras. The lesson is install a conscience that keeps filming when the adrenaline fades, and that difference could change your street before the next collection day. On screen, illusion flickers in a thinner font, and I admit how many times I've mistaken tightness for safety, rules for love, familiarity for virtue, the same way we mistake packaging for product until the cardboard cuts us. You ask what to do with the clip, and I ask what to do with the wiring that made it necessary, because evidence changes meetings, but only introspection changes neighborhoods. I replay the night in my head and notice how easily grievance found a body, how quickly authority borrowed a shoe, how silently compliance asked to hold my mouth while it took notes for the minutes. This is the moment where the philosophical turns painfully practical, not a lecture on Foucault this time, but a checklist taped inside your skull for the exact second your foot itches to rise. On screen, pause surfaces, because the first reform is temporal. Slow the scene, swallow the heat, translate the urge into a question, and ask who you are trying to become by winning. I tell you to draft a small constitution for your home that outvotes your pride. No kicks, no ambushes, no emails sent after midnight with righteousness as a CC, only conversations that begin before the lid flips. This is not sentiment. It is counterpower, because the softest revolution is learning to dislike the taste of domination even when you are the one holding the ladle. On screen, repair floats. And I remind you that repair is not reversal. It is the courage to stand in the frame after the act and let accountability resize you. We talk a lot about standards, so let me propose one worth laminating. No standard that requires humiliation is standard enough to live by, and no order that refuses care earns the name order. I am not asking you to surrender boundaries. I am asking you to stop outsourcing your soul to them, because fences rot when they are asked to carry more than wood. On screen, neighbor appears, and I define the word without the brochure, someone whose dignity you protect as if it were your own, because one day it will be. If this sounds grand, remember that power scales trivially. What happens to a bin happens to a body. What happens to a body happens to a block. What happens to a block writes policy in a room where you will not be invited unless you bring a quiet army of witnesses. The camera taught me something I don't like. We are never only watched from the outside. We are watched by the person we are practicing, and that audience is brutal. On screen, practice holds for a beat, because routines become character, and character becomes law, and one day your reflex will be someone else's regulation. I look at you and say the scariest line I know, we are what we enforce, and I let the silence after it sit like a third participant we cannot charm. If the HOA is a microcosm, then your workplace is too, and your group chat, and your family dinner, each one a jurisdiction where someone is always tempted to deputize their pain and issue citations to the nearest face. So here's my call: unglamorous and inescapable. Become the person who interrupts the audit of being, who asks to what end, who says not like this, who trades the spectacle of winning for the discipline of repair. On screen, choice brightens then dims because the choice is repetitive, not cinematic. You will make it on Tuesday at 4:17 p.m. when the email lands, or Saturday morning when the music next door is louder than your patience. I won't romanticize it. The cost of refusing cheap power is a loneliness that stings, and the dividend is a community that might never thank you out loud. But listen, quiet is not absence. Quiet is potential. And if enough of us choose to be unfashionably decent, the street will change its posture even when no lens is blinking. I told you earlier that evidence persuades committees and truth interrogates the soul. Let me add the missing clause. Courage reconciles the two because courage says the same thing in public and in private and doesn't need a red dot to stay honest. On screen, courage lands like a stamp. And I confess that some days I have it, and some days I only rehearse it, which is why I am asking you to build redundancies in your character the way engineers build redundancies into bridges. If you need a ritual, borrow mine. Place the bin at 6 inches, not as defiance, but as a meditation. Breathe once for anger and twice for curiosity. Then ask what story you would be proud to have recorded with no edits. Your street will still have arguments. Your board will still issue letters. Your inbox will still meet the morning like weather you cannot control, but you will no longer be recruitable by the urge to dominate. On screen, power returns as an outline instead of a block, because power is not a thing you own, it is a pattern you practice, and patterns can be rewritten with enough repetitions of the right discomfort. Let me be unkind to the myth we prefer. There is no they who will fix this, only a we who must unfurl in dozens of small, brave gestures until the bylaws look obvious in the way kindness looks obvious after it is finally tried. If you need a historical friend besides the theorists, choose the janitors of history, the people who cleaned up after the powerful and saw what rules do to rooms, because they know the texture of consequences and the miracle of a floor that doesn't stick. On screen, witness sits in the lower third, and I ask you to redefine the word as a verb. To witness is to stand near truth without flinching, and then to carry it without ornament into the next conversation. I know you came for a climax and a tidy exit. What I can give you instead is an apprenticeship in attention, a way of looking that makes kicks improbable long before they become illegal. The neighbor still walks his dog. I still film my porch at night, and the bin still rolls to the curb with its small plastic dignity. But something structural has shifted. We have agreed, you and I, to distrust any solution that tastes like someone else's humiliation. On screen, care returns, now steady, and I tell you care is not the opposite of order. It is order's adult form. If you must leave with a single sentence, let it be this: do not outsource your ethics to the loudest rule in the room, because rules don't love you, and love is the only standard that won't ask for bruises. When the episode ends, the algorithm will offer you new outrages to binge, but I am asking you to click on your life instead, to walk onto your porch and adjust something small until it means something large. The camera will keep me honest here, but you will have to keep yourself honest there. And that is the terrifying gift of being human without a script. On screen, be the lens fades up and then away, and I tell you that the best lens is the one you internalize so deeply that no one needs to catch you to make you decent. I said at the start that a plastic bin could expose the illusion we live by. I will end by saying that a plastic bin can also inaugurate a truth we can live with. If this story unsettled you, keep the unsettled part. That is the seed, and seeds are instruments of quiet revolutions that do not need meetings to pass. The street is breathing again. The night is ordinary. The porch light is only a porch light, and yet I swear the air has learned a new word. On screen, begin glows for a final beat. And I look into you rather than at you and ask the only question that matters now. When the next small moment arrives, will you kick, or will you choose to build the kind of order that can bear the weight of being seen?